The knock came after sundown. It wasn't a polite tap. It was the sound of splintering wood, of desperation. The kind of sound that tells you trouble isn't coming. It's already here, pounding on your door in the middle of a storm. Silas Boone didn't move. He just sat by the fire, his pipe cold in his hand, and listened to the rain slash against the cabin. Out here, miles from anyone, a knock after dark was a death sentence delivered by a stranger. This far out in the territories, you didn't open your door for anything but the sunrise. The second knock was different. Softer. A wet, dragging sound, like a body slumping against the door. That's what got him up. He grabbed the shotgun leaning against the wall, the cold steel a familiar weight in his hands. His limp was bad tonight, a sharp reminder of the canyon fall 2 winters back. The same fall that took his wife, Sarah. The same fall that turned Silas Boone from a man into a ghost who just happened to still be breathing. He cracked the door just enough to see. A woman stood there, drenched, looking like she'd been born from the storm itself. Her hair was a mess of wet brown strands stuck to her face. Her dress, maybe it was yellow once, was now just a darker shade of rain. She was cradling something in her arms, a bundle wrapped in a gray blanket, heavy with water. Lightning flashed, and for a second, the world lit up. That's when he saw her face. Pale, a dark bruise blooming on her jaw, a gash on her temple still leaking blood. Her eyes met his, and there was no plea in them. Just an exhaustion so deep, it looked like it had been carved into her soul. She took a shaky breath, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. "He ain't yours," she said, "but he needs you." Silas looked down at the bundle. A baby. Couldn't be more than a few months old. Its eyes were open, staring right at him, dark and ancient and knowing. It wasn't crying. It was just watching. "No," Silas said, and he shut the door in her face. He leaned his back against the solid wood, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The fire popped, the rain beat down, and the whole world felt like it was closing in. He squeezed his eyes shut. A woman with bruises, a baby in the rain. A memory he'd spent 2 years burying tried to claw its way out. He counted to 10, then to 20. The dragging sound didn't come back. The knocking stopped. There was only the storm. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He wrenched the door open again. The porch was empty. The night was a wall of black. He stepped out, the cold rain hitting him like tiny needles. He scanned the tree line, the muddy trail, the deep shadows where anything could be hiding. There was no woman, no footprints in the mud that he could see. It was like she'd never been there at all. Except for one thing. A bundle on the porch, right where she'd been standing. He knelt down, his bad leg screaming in protest. The baby was still wrapped in the gray blanket, soaked and cold, but still not crying. It was barely moving. That's what scared him. A still baby was a baby on the edge of forever. Tucked into the folds of the blanket was a piece of paper, crumpled and bleeding ink. He could just make out the words, scrawled in a desperate hand. "Don't let him grow up like his father." Silas stared at the note, then at the child. He hadn't held a baby since Sarah, since the canyon. He wouldn't think about that. Not now. He scooped the child up. It was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against the storm. The baby blinked at him and let out a soft grunt, a small, questioning sound that hit Silas harder than any bullet ever could. Inside, he laid the baby by the dying fire and stoked the embers back to life. He stripped off his own flannel shirt and wrapped the boy in it, the dry wool a small comfort against the wet cold. He didn't have milk. He had corn mush, some dried beans, and bread hard enough to break a tooth on. Not exactly baby food. He dipped a cloth in warm water and gently wiped the baby's face. The child's hand, so small and wrinkled, grabbed his finger. "I don't know what I'm doing," Silas muttered to the quiet cabin. The baby just stared back, those dark, knowing eyes seeming to look right through him. The storm raged on. Thunder rattled the windows. Silas kept looking at the door, half expecting the woman to come back, half praying she wouldn't. She didn't. Around midnight, the baby started to cry. A thin, sharp sound. Silas picked him up and started humming, a low, tuneless noise his father used to make to calm spooked horses. It was a sound that meant nothing, but felt like safety. After a long while, the crying stopped. He sat in his chair, the baby asleep on his chest, a small warmth seeping into the cold hollow he'd been carrying for 2 years. "You're just troubled, ain't you?" he whispered. He looked at the door one last time. There was no more knocking, but the sound still echoed in his bones. By the time the sun came up, the man who had sworn off the world was holding its smallest, most helpless piece. And deep inside him, something he thought had died in that canyon began to stir. Silas woke with a jolt, the gray morning light filtering through the window. For a second, he didn't know what the weight on his chest was. Then he looked down and saw the baby, curled up like a little fox, sound asleep. It was real. The storm, the woman, the child. It hadn't been some whiskey-fueled nightmare. He sat up, his back cracking like a dry twig. "You're still here," he grumbled, though there was no real anger in his voice. He'd half convinced himself he'd wake up to an empty cabin, the whole night just a cruel trick of his memory. But the boy was real, and he was hungry. Silas tore up an old flour sack for a makeshift diaper, boiled some water, and made a thin broth from crushed beans. He tried to feed the boy with his thumb, and the baby took a little. Not much, but some. And through it all, the boy was quiet. Silent. It was the silence that got to Silas. Babies were supposed to scream. This one seemed to know better. It was as if someone had already taught him that making noise was a dangerous mistake. An hour later, Silas was on his mule, heading to town with the baby tucked into a sling against his chest. The town of Redemption wasn't a friendly place. It was a hard town for hard people. They stared as he rode in, their eyes full of suspicion. At the general store, old Mara, a woman whose face was a roadmap of everyone else's business, narrowed her eyes. "Ain't yours," she said. It wasn't a question. Silas just grunted and bought what he needed: powdered milk, clean linen, a bottle, and shotgun shells. Always more shotgun shells. Down the street, Sheriff Danner leaned against his office door. Danner was a man who preferred to let trouble solve itself, usually with a bullet. "Found someone's mistake, Boone," he drawled. "Found someone's son," Silas replied, not breaking stride. He mounted his mule and rode out, the sheriff's cold eyes following him all the way. Back at the cabin, Silas fed the baby properly this time. He'd made a small bed out of a dresser drawer, lined with his softest wool blanket. He stood over the drawer for a long time, just watching the boy sleep. He was examining the child, making sure he was all right, when he saw it. On the baby's tiny foot, hidden on the heel, was a mark. It was small, barely visible. Not a birthmark. It was a brand, a perfect, tiny shape seared into the skin. A snake eating its own tail. An Ouroboros. Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. A brand meant ownership. This baby wasn't just abandoned. He was property. And someone, somewhere, would be looking for their property. That night he didn't sit on the porch. He sat inside, the shotgun across his lap, and waited. He rocked the boy, the motion automatic, and his mind went back to another child. His child. The one he and Sarah had buried behind the barn 3 winters ago. A little girl born too soon, too small for this world. He dug the grave himself, his hands bleeding from the frozen ground. He hadn't spoken more than 5 words at a time to anyone since. This new child, this branded boy, was digging up ghosts Silas had sworn to keep buried. Near dawn, he heard a twig snap outside. He was up in an instant, rifle in hand, moving like a shadow to the back door. He slipped outside into the pre-dawn gloom, and he saw them. Footprints. Small, barefoot. The woman's. She hadn't gone far. He followed the tracks to the edge of the riverbank, where they vanished. Snagged on a thorny bush was a tiny scrap of yellow cloth, the same color as her dress. She'd been watching. All night. Watching to see if he was a man who would help, or a man who would leave a baby to die on his porch. Silas stared into the dark woods, the rifle resting on his shoulder. "You could have knocked again," he whispered to the trees. He turned to go back to the cabin, but something else caught his eye. Down by the river's edge, half buried in the mud, was something small and metallic. He dug it out. It was a locket. Tarnished brass on a broken chain. He pried it open. Inside, there wasn't a picture. There was a tiny folded piece of paper. He carefully unfolded it. It wasn't a note. It was a list, names, dates, places. And next to each name, a number. It looked like a ledger. He didn't understand what he was looking at, but a cold knot of dread formed in his stomach. The woman, the baby, the brand, the ledger. This was more than a woman running from a cruel man. This was something bigger, darker. He went back inside. The baby was awake, his eyes fixed on the door, as if he was waiting. Silas sat on the floor, the cold locket in his hand. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was just the beginning. The storm that brought the woman was over, but a different kind of storm, one made of blood and violence, was just about to break. For 3 days, the world was quiet. Too quiet. Silas fell into a routine. Feed the boy, change him, chop wood, watch the trail. He called the boy Rowan. The name just came to him one afternoon as he watched a rowan tree's leaves turn in the wind. It felt right. He kept the locket hidden, tucked away in his saddlebag. Every night he'd take it out, stare at the list of names and numbers, and try to make sense of it. They were towns, Silverton, Durango, Willow Creek, and names he didn't recognize. Next to each was a figure. $500, $1,200, $3,000. It read like a list of debts or payments. On the 4th day, the quiet broke. It wasn't a knock this time. It was a visitor. A man on a tall black horse, dressed in a long, dust-colored coat. He didn't ride up like a neighbor. He rode up like a man measuring a grave. Silas met him on the porch, shotgun in hand. The man was tall and thin, with cheekbones like razors and eyes like chips of black ice. He had a fancy revolver on one hip, a long knife on the other. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You Silas Boone?" he asked, his voice smooth as a polished stone. "Depends who's asking." "Name's Ruckler," the man said. "I ride for a man named Maddox, Clay Maddox." The name hit Silas like a physical blow. Clay Maddox. The name was a plague whispered across the territory. A man who was less a man and more a monster. Bank robber, killer, a man who'd reportedly burned down a church with the preacher still inside it, all over a bottle of whiskey. There was a bounty on his head big enough to buy a whole town, but no one was brave enough or stupid enough to try and collect it. "Heard you came into possession of something that belongs to him," Ruckler said, his eyes flicking toward the cabin door. "A woman left a child on my porch," Silas said, his voice flat. "If that's what you mean." "That woman is a thief, and that child is his," Ruckler said. "Maddox is a man who likes to get his property back. He sent me as a courtesy. You can tell Maddox the boy's staying here." Ruckler's smile widened. "That's the wrong answer, old man. Maddox doesn't ask twice. He sent me to get the boy, and a locket she stole from him. Silas's blood ran cold. The locket. Don't know about any locket, Silas lied, his grip tightening on the shotgun. Ruckler just chuckled. He said you'd say that. See, that locket isn't just a piece of jewelry. It's his account book. Every dirty deal, every bribe, every man he paid off, from here to the capital. It's his whole life. And you're holding it. The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just about a baby. It was about leverage. It was about evidence that could bring down not just Maddox, but a whole network of corruption. He wants the boy and the ledger, Ruckler said, his voice dropping low. You give them to me now, and he'll let you live out your miserable days in this shack. You refuse, well, he told me to get creative. Get off my land, Silas said. Ruckler's smile vanished. He tipped his hat. As you wish. He turned his horse and started to ride away. Then he stopped and turned back. By the way, Boone, Sarah was a pretty name. Shame about that fall in the canyon. Accidents happen, don't they? The threat hung in the air, sharp and poisonous. This wasn't just a hired gun. This was personal. They knew about him. They knew about his wife. Silas watched him disappear down the trail, his knuckles white on the stock of his gun. He went inside and barred the door. Rowan was asleep in his drawer cradle, peaceful, unaware of the wolves circling. He held the baby close. This child wasn't just an orphan. He was a key, a witness, and the son of the most dangerous man in the territory. The note came back to him. Don't let him grow up like his father. It wasn't just a plea. It was a warning. That night, Silas didn't sleep. He nailed boards over the windows. He buried the locket under the hearthstone. He sat in the dark, shotgun loaded, and listened to the sounds of the night, waiting for the devil to come and collect his due. The next morning, he found it on his porch. A dead crow, its neck snapped, laid carefully on his doormat. A message. The siege had begun. The town of Redemption was dying of fear. 5 days after Ruckler's visit, the livery stable burned to the ground. Silas rode in to see the smoldering ruins, the smell of burnt horseflesh thick in the air. Sheriff Danner was there, his face pale and smudged with soot. Someone threw a lantern, Danner said, not looking Silas in the eye. Left a message carved on the door. He showed Silas a piece of charred wood. Burned into it was a single word. Boone. He's not just coming for you, Silas, Danner whispered, his voice shaky. He's coming for all of us. He's making an example. The town won't help you. They're too scared. I never asked for their help, Silas said, his eyes scanning the faces of the townsfolk. They wouldn't meet his gaze. They just stared, their faces a mixture of pity and terror. They were looking at a dead man walking. You should run, Danner said. Take the boy and disappear into the mountains. Running is what got that boy's mother killed, Silas replied, though he didn't know if it was true. He just knew you couldn't outrun a man like Maddox. You had to face him, or die trying. When he got back to the cabin, he knew something was wrong. The air was too still. The door was slightly ajar. He dismounted, rifle ready, and pushed the door open. She was there. Maeve, the woman from the storm. She was sitting on the floor, holding Rowan, rocking him gently. She looked worse than before. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow, and fresh bruises marred her arms. I saw the smoke, she whispered, her voice raspy. I knew he'd started. Where have you been? Silas demanded, lowering the rifle but keeping his guard up. Hiding. Watching, she said. He found me a few days after I left Rowan here, in Silverton. He told me he forgave me. Then he broke 2 of my ribs to prove it. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a pain that went deeper than any broken bone. I had to see him, one last time, to make sure he was safe. He's safe, Silas said. For now. He told her about Ruckler, about the locket, the ledger. She nodded, not surprised. It's all in there, she said. The sheriff in Willow Creek, the judge in Durango. He owns them all. That ledger is the only thing that can stop him. That's why I took it. I thought I could trade it for my freedom, for Rowan's freedom. He won't trade, Silas said. He'll just take. I know, she whispered. She gently kissed Rowan's forehead. His name is Rowan. I never got to say it out loud before. It's a good name, Silas said softly. They sat in silence for a moment. The man who'd lost everything and the woman who'd never had anything to lose, bound together by the small child sleeping between them. He's coming soon, Maeve finally said. Tonight, maybe. He won't send Ruckler this time. He'll come himself, and he won't come alone. I can hold this ground, Silas said, his jaw set. You're one man. I've been one man for a long time. It doesn't mean I'm weak. Maeve looked at him then, a long, searching look. She saw the grief in his eyes, but she also saw something else, something hard and unbreakable, something that wouldn't run. She stood up, her decision made. I'll stay, she said. I'm done running. Silas nodded once. Reckon it's your cabin too, till the storm passes. As dusk fell, they prepared for war. Maeve, surprisingly, knew her way around a pistol. She moved with a grim efficiency, helping Silas barricade the windows and doors. They were two broken people, standing against a force of nature, with nothing but a log cabin, 2 guns, and a shared, unspoken promise to protect the sleeping child. The sky outside darkened, the clouds gathering like a bruise. The wind picked up, howling through the pines. A different kind of storm was coming, one that rained bullets and fed on blood. Silas looked over at Maeve, her face illuminated by the flickering lantern light. He looked at Rowan, safe in his cradle. He had 47 shells, 2 rifles, and a reason to live through the night. It would have to be enough. The rain started just after midnight. A cold, miserable drizzle that promised to turn into a downpour. Inside the cabin, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and Rowan's soft breathing. Maeve was checking the pistol Silas had given her, her movements precise and calm. The fear was still there. She could feel it coiling in her gut, but it was a cold, hard fear now, not the panicked terror she had lived with for years. It was the fear of a cornered animal, ready to fight. Silas sat at the table, his rifle across his lap, his eyes on the boarded-up window. He was a statue carved from granite and regret. You think he'll kill us? Maeve asked, her voice quiet. He's already decided to, Silas answered without looking at her. He can't let that ledger exist. He can't let you exist. He can't let a man who defied him exist. And Rowan? Silas was silent for a long moment. He thinks the boy is his blood, his legacy. He won't kill him. He'll take him, and he'll turn him into a monster, just like him. That was the truth they were fighting against, not just for their lives, but for a child's soul. The first sound from outside wasn't a shout, it was a whistle. A long, low bird call that was answered from the other side of the clearing. They're here, Silas said, his voice a low growl. They're in position, smart. They're trying to draw our fire, see where we are. He stood and moved to a small crack he'd left in the boards. The night was pitch black, the rain turning the world into a smear of gray and black. But he saw them. Shapes, moving through the trees, at least 4 of them. The first shot came without warning. It wasn't aimed at the window. It tore through the roof, sending splinters and shingles down onto the floor. A message. We can hit you anywhere we want. Rowan woke up with a startled cry. Maeve was on him in a second, scooping him up, her body shielding his. Another shot ripped through the wall, inches from where Silas's head had been. "They're toying with us," Silas hissed, ducking low. "Maddox is out there watching. He wants us scared." "I'm past scared," Maeve said, her voice tight. She moved quickly, pulling up a loose floorboard near the hearth that led to a small root cellar. She wrapped Rowan in every blanket they had and placed him gently inside. "Stay quiet, little one," she whispered, her heart breaking. She closed the floorboard over him just as the front door exploded inwards. A man charged in, a big bearded man with a wild look in his eyes. Silas fired the shotgun. The blast threw the man backward off the porch and into the mud. Another figure darted in, firing blindly. Maeve shot back. The bullet went wide, but it made the man dive for cover behind the overturned table. Before he could raise his pistol, Silas was on him, using the rifle as a club. There was a sickening crunch of bone, and the man went limp. Silence descended again, thick and heavy, broken only by the sound of the rain and their own ragged breathing. Then, footsteps on the porch, slow, deliberate, confident. Clay Maddox stepped through the shattered doorway. He was bigger than Silas had imagined, a mountain of a man in a long black coat dripping with rain. His beard was shot through with gray, and his eyes were a pale, dead green, the eyes of a man who had burned out his own soul long ago. He ignored Silas. His gaze landed on Maeve. "You've been a lot of trouble, girl," he said, his voice a low rumble. Maeve raised her pistol, her hand shaking but her aim steady. "He's not yours, Clay. He was never yours." Maddox actually laughed, a cold, cruel sound. "Blood is blood. You stole my son." "I saved my son," she screamed back. "From you." Maddox's smile faded. He finally turned his attention to Silas, who stood near the hearth, bleeding from a cut on his forehead. "You're the ghost of redemption, aren't you? The man who lost his wife in the canyon. You should have stayed dead." "I know what happened in that canyon, Maddox," Silas said, his voice dangerously low. "It was no accident. You were there." Maddox froze. The confidence in his eyes flickered, replaced by a flash of surprise, then rage. "You're a liar." "Am I?" Silas took a step forward. "You thought I was dead when you pushed me, but I saw you. I saw you standing over her." The world seemed to shrink to the space between the two men. Maeve stared, her mind reeling. "He pushed you," she whispered. Maddox didn't have to answer. The truth was written all over his face. He raised his revolver. "Doesn't matter. Ghosts can die twice." But Maeve fired first. The bullet caught Maddox in the shoulder. He roared in pain and fury, staggering back. He swung his gun toward her, his face a mask of hate. Silas charged, bringing his rifle butt down on Maddox's arm. The gun clattered to the floor. But Maddox was too strong. He threw Silas off him like a rag doll. Silas hit the wall hard, the wind knocked out of him. Maddox lunged for his gun. And that's when Rowan cried. It wasn't a baby's whimper. It was a full-throated, furious scream, echoing up from under the floorboards. A cry of life, of defiance, in a room filled with death. The sound made Maddox pause for a single fatal second. He looked down at the floor, confused. It was all the time Silas needed. He surged to his feet, ignoring the fire in his ribs, and fired the shotgun. At point-blank range, the blast was devastating. Clay Maddox was thrown against the far wall and slid to the floor, his dead green eyes staring at nothing. The silence that followed was absolute. Slowly, carefully, Maeve lifted the floorboard. She pulled Rowan out, holding him tight, burying her face in his blankets, sobbing with relief. Silas sagged against the wall, the shotgun falling from his hands. He slid to the floor, his leg finally giving out. "Is he—" Maeve looked from the baby to the bloody heap that was Clay Maddox. "He's dead," she said. Then she looked at Silas, truly looked at him, at the blood and the pain and the sheer, stubborn will that had kept him alive. "You knew all this time?" "I didn't know for sure," Silas breathed. "Not until I saw his eyes again. The same eyes I saw in the canyon, right before I fell." The rain outside began to soften. Dawn was coming. They had survived the night. They had faced the devil and won. But the real fight, the one to heal the wounds that couldn't be seen, was just beginning. They weren't just survivors. They were something new, forged in violence and loss. Not a family, not yet. But maybe, just maybe, the start of one. The first morning after the storm was unnervingly quiet. Mist hung over the valley like a shroud, and the world smelled clean, washed of blood and gunpowder. Inside the cabin, Silas was patching himself up. The cut on his head was deep, and he was pretty sure Maddox had cracked one of his ribs. But he was alive. That was more than he'd expected. Maeve was tending to Rowan, her movements gentle and sure. She'd found some old clothes of Sarah's packed away in a trunk and had changed into a simple brown dress. It was too big for her, but it was clean and dry. She looked different. The haunted, hunted look in her eyes was gone, replaced by a weary calm. They didn't talk about the night before, or the canyon. The words were too big, too heavy for the fragile peace of the new day. Instead, they moved around each other in a quiet rhythm, cleaning the cabin, mending the door, erasing the violence as best they could. Around noon, a rider approached. It was Sheriff Danner. He rode up slow, his hand hovering near his gun, his eyes taking in the bullet-riddled cabin. Silas met him on the porch. He didn't bother to pick up his rifle. "Heard there was a war out here," Danner said, his gaze fixed on Silas's bandaged head. "War's over," Silas replied. "Maddox?" "Buried him out back. His men too." Danner let out a long, slow breath, a breath he looked like he'd been holding for years. "The town owes you. I owe you." He looked genuinely relieved. Then his eyes hardened slightly. "There's just one thing. The locket. The ledger." Silas stared at him. "What about it?" "It lists names," Danner said carefully. "Important names. A man could get himself in a lot of trouble holding on to something like that. A man could also find himself rewarded for making it disappear." The offer hung in the air. A bribe. He wasn't here to enforce the law. He was here to contain the damage. "Some of those names," Danner continued, "they're my friends, business associates." "The kind of business that gets people killed?" Silas asked, his voice cold. "It's a hard territory," Danner shrugged. "Sometimes you have to make hard choices to keep the peace." "That isn't peace," Silas said. "It's a rotten foundation, and this whole territory is built on it." From inside the cabin, Maeve appeared, holding Rowan. She looked Danner straight in the eye. "That ledger cost me everything. It's not for sale." Danner's face tightened. He looked from Silas's cold fury to Maeve's unbreakable resolve. He was a man used to getting his way, but he saw something in their eyes that told him he wouldn't win this time. Something had changed in them. They weren't afraid anymore. He sighed, defeated. "Fine, but you're making powerful enemies. This won't end with Maddox." "It ends with the truth," Silas said. He turned and walked back inside, leaving the sheriff standing alone in the yard. Danner watched them for a moment, then turned his horse and rode away, a man heading back to a town built on lies. Silas dug the locket out from under the hearthstone and handed it to Maeve. "It's yours. Your choice what to do with it." She held it in her palm, the weight of it, the years of pain it represented. She walked to the fire, her hand open, ready to let it fall into the flames, to destroy the past and be free. But she stopped. She looked at Rowan, sleeping peacefully in his cradle. She thought of all the other women, the other families, terrorized by Maddox and the powerful men in his ledger. Burning it would be freedom for her, but it wouldn't be justice for them. No, she said, her voice clear and strong. It doesn't end here. We finish this the right way. The next day, Silas and Maeve rode out together. They didn't ride to redemption. They rode east toward the state capital. It was a long, dangerous journey. Maddox was dead, but his network was not. The men in that ledger would do anything to keep their secrets buried. They were hunted, ambushed twice on the road, but they fought back, side by side. The quiet man who'd forgotten how to live, and the broken woman who'd never been allowed to. They were no longer just survivors, they were fighters. Weeks later, they arrived at the capital, weary and battered, but alive. They walked into the office of the U.S. Marshal and handed him the locket. The fallout was like a lightning storm. Judges were impeached, sheriffs were arrested. The foundation of corruption that had ruled the territory for a generation crumbled to dust. Silas and Maeve didn't stay to watch. They turned around and rode home. When they arrived back at the cabin on the ridge, it was autumn. The leaves on the rowan tree were turning a brilliant red. The cabin felt different. It wasn't a place of isolation and grief anymore. It was a home. That night they sat on the porch, watching the stars come out. Rowan, now a few months older, was asleep inside. "You know," Maeve said softly, "I used to dream of a place like this. A place where you could just breathe." Silas looked at her. Her face, in the soft moonlight, was no longer marked by fear. It was just beautiful. "You're safe now, Maeve," he said. "We're safe," she corrected him, and she reached out and took his hand. His rough, calloused hand fit perfectly in hers. They didn't need to say the words. They had lived them. They had fought for each other, bled for each other. They had faced down ghosts and monsters and built something new in the ashes. It wasn't a story with a perfect happy ending. The scars were still there. The memories would always linger. But as they sat there, hand in hand, with a child sleeping peacefully inside, they had found something better than a happy ending. They had found a beginning. What started with a desperate knock in a storm ended in the quiet peace of a family that chose to be. Sometimes the greatest storms don't come to destroy you, but to clear a path for the person you were always meant to become. If you enjoyed this story, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments below, what would you have done if you were Silas?